What is going on, Sharp Football family? It is your resident Swami of Konami, Rich Hribar, and we are here the final week of July. Training camps are opening everywhere. Every team is reported, so we've got that going for us. Quick housekeeping note at the top before I bring my guest in. You can go and get Warren Sharp's 2024 preview book right now on the website. Not only can you do that, you can get the draft kit that myself and Raymond Summerlin are poured hours already into on the website. Definitely go check those two things out at the site. Without further ado, let's jump into it here. I've got a good guest here. I haven't seen this person in a while here. I think it's been about a year or two, maybe even. But we've got Joe Dolan on. He's the fantasy managing editor at Fantasy Data. Fantasy Points, I'm sorry. Fantasy Data is like the thing that you guys have
Fantasy Points Data. Yeah, there we go. You got it.
That's a thing fired up that everyone's going crazy. You also do the co-host of the Fantasy Feast with Ross Tucker. You took over for the late, great Evan Silva. I shouldn't say late, because he's still among us. But and also Joe's birthday was yesterday. So everyone wish Joe a happy birthday.
I appreciate that, Reeves. It's wonderful to be with you. Yeah, I haven't seen you since the at least face to face since the expo a couple of years ago. I'm not going this year. I don't know if you are, but I'm glad we could catch up at least in this format, which is wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always enjoyed hanging out with you. When we met, I think it was several years ago in New York. We hit it off, had a good time. Yeah, had a real good time there. As I mentioned at the lead-in, every team is now in camp. It feels real. We're moving downhill. It's going to be August. The Hall of Fame game is closing in. So I want to talk about some quick training camp battles and some training camp stuff. But first, I kind of want to just ask you in general, how do you handle the news cycle this time of year? Obviously everyone's tweeting out clips of players and how things are doing. So what are some of the things you're looking for as far as reporting goes this time of year?
So first and foremost, I want to throw out Dolan's annual training camp disclaimer. I tweeted on the first day of training camp every year. Carted off does not mean serious injury in training camp. So, you're always going to see, I think, as a matter of fact, I literally just saw one. The Eagles saying Jeremiah Trotter Jr., Eagles beat writers, was carted off. Well, he was down early in the session, returned to practice, and my guess is he was just dinged up or something, and they carted him back to the locker room. Guys get carted back to the locker room for every reason, including having to pee in training camp. That is a fact. Now, it doesn't mean they aren't seriously hurt, but just wait for the facts. And I've literally been in live drafts. As a matter of fact, I think when Matt Camp and I were hosting the Kings Classic a couple of years ago, there was a player, I forget exactly who it was carted off during training camp, at a practice, and he started plummeting in the draft, and it turned out to be nothing. So that's one thing that I want to say. Number two, obviously, some drum beats are going to be true, Reeves. There's going to be, hey, keep an eye out for this guy. Keep an eye out for this guy. But a lot of times, past performance you have to take into account. And I think the big example of that is the great Kenny Pickett caper of 2023. They're going to throw the ball all over the field. And there's a lot of reasons that Kenny Pickett might not have succeeded, but you try to balance everything out. There's going to be some very legitimate drum beats. There's going to be guys who look great in the preseason, some younger guys who maybe haven't gotten an opportunity to play. The guys we haven't seen a lot of, those are the guys I'm more interested in when there's steady drum beats of positivity. The guys who have stunk for 3 years, okay. As somebody who's fallen off the Sky Moore plane a couple of times, just understand that those guys are most likely to stink going forward.
Yeah, this was always historically the time of the year where Devontae Parker was getting ramped up.
Huge.
He was a huge training camp guy jumping over people. I always remind people that, I only did news at Roto World for a very brief stint, but, I remember kind of, scouring the athletic articles and everything, trying to come up with some news things to blurb right while I was on shift. And always one of the things you want to take with a grain of salt is anything that's just cooked in with opinion or projection, right? One of the beats just saying how a guy looks or projecting a player, Pat Freiermuth could catch 100 passes this season. Those are things the beat writers don't have skin in the game on, right? They're not doing mathematical models and figuring out how much target dispersal there is and how many finite number of targets. And we had one of those before training camp started last weekend, and it was with the Denver Broncos, where there was a report that Javonte Williams is fighting for a roster spot, even though the Broncos had yet to start training camp. Then we get to yesterday, and Javonte Williams is taking all the first team reps with the running back group.
Right.
So let's start there with the Denver Broncos running back situation. One, how much are you stocking that Javonte Williams is truly on the roster bubble? Two, how are you playing this backfield in general? Because we know from a top-down stance, like Sean Payton's backfields have always scored a lot of fantasy points. So how are you approaching the Denver backfield this offseason?
So I have been out on Javonte all off season. I was out on him all last year. That obviously worked out. And he's a player I loved coming out, and I loved him in 2022. And it was absolutely disgusting to see Nate Hackett throw washed Melvin Gordon out there to fumble 3 times a game while Javonte was in a rotation. And then they cut Melvin Gordon after Javonte gets hurt, right? Thanks, guys. But look, that injury was bad. Their offense was bad last year. And I think I'm just kind of leaning into the fact that I think that offense is going to be not so great this year.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm not drafting Javonte. Our guy, Chris Wecht at Fantasy Points, who's our projections guru, has been absolutely, and I have to give him credit for fighting on this. Like every single time in our staff Discord, like one of us throws in, oh, here's another report about Javonte being dead, and here's another report about Javonte being cut. He's like, I don't see it. And then of course he takes all the first team reps. So he's like, this is all opinion from these guys.
Right.
But that being said, I'm still not drafting him. Like at RB30, there's guys around there who I have just outright preferred. And I've been taking my shots on Jaleel McLaughlin and Audric Estime. And the fact of the matter is Javonte Williams might be on this team, but if he looks the same as he did last year, and that's an if, because Sean Payton was talking him up saying he's lost weight and all that, he's going to lose carries because now they're equipped to have guys who come in. Samaje Perine last year took a lot of those high-calorie fantasy touches. I call Samaje Perine, who is on the roster bubble, I truly believe, he's a coach's pet. He doesn't fumble. He catches the ball and he blocks. He doesn't do anything when he has the ball in his hand, but he does the things that coaches like. So I just feel like if Javonte Williams looks the same this season, he's going to lose carries to the younger players. That's why and the offense isn't going to be very good. That's why I'm out on Javonte Williams, but I'd be stunned if he was cut. And quite frankly, if he were cut, I might be in on him. Because you might be able to just shave a star into the side of his head at that point, because a team like Dallas could use a running back. So Javonte getting cut might actually be good for fantasy football. I just don't see it happening at this point.
Yeah. Spin off that thought. So in these drafts that are going on now, are you trying to play that angle at all that, a Miles Sanders, one of these Broncos running backs could end up being in a better spot next year? Or is that just like a needle you're just not going to try to throw?
Yeah, the one who I've kind of tried to play that on is Khalil Herbert, because I know Khalil Herbert is good, like he's produced, and there just might not be a role for him or a roster spot for him in Chicago right now. I know Bears fans have been, Bears beat writers are saying he was pretty impressive in the first day of training camp. But maybe the Bears, they gave a lot of money to DeAndre Swift, and they drafted Rashawn Johnson in the 4th round last year. So Khalil Herbert is probably their 3rd running back right now. Maybe they can get an asset for him. That's been the one guy, like Miles Sanders. He's not even getting drafted in best ball. We'll cross the Miles Sanders bridge if it comes to that. But Khalil Herbert's a guy who I feel like if he sticks with the Bears, there's a chance he has a role. And at RB 58, wherever he's going on Underdog right now, I think that's an interesting buy because he's a younger player. That's the kind of guy who Dallas should target in the trade market. And I do expect Dallas will make a move at running back.
Yeah, I've been in that boat too with the Cowboys. That's why I didn't even put him on like the pre-show kind of notes of like, are we going to try to like do the Zeke thing again? Or are you buying Rico Dowdle? I think it's just still like a nebulous spot right now. And I don't really want to get too far into the weeds on those Dallas running backs. One of the guys we saw last week when training camps did start was we saw Xavier Worthy come and catch a long touchdown. Everyone goes up. Like you said, if you're in on these drafts, especially if you're on these underdog drafts where like the clock is 8 hours, you'll start to see people use the clock and wait for news to kind of come. But after Xavier Worthy caught that long video, that pass in the video, like he shot up in ADP a little bit. Like he started to get drafted into the leagues I was in a little earlier. And I said, here we go. Obviously he's missed like the last couple of days with an illness, but the Chiefs wide receiver situation, they've been trying to kind of the last 2 years replicate kind of what they had lost in Tyreek Hill. And it wasn't an issue in 2022 because Travis Kelce was still Travis Kelce. But last year with Travis Kelce being kind of a limited version of himself, and maybe he just bounces back and is healthier this year. But you've seen them add speed at wide receiver, Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy. And you've got, Rashee Rice, who kind of popped as a rookie there and kind of a unique role, kind of like that early career Jarvis Landry type role where they just got him the ball at the line of scrimmage a bunch and just let him kind of break tackles. And then we'll see where he kind of manifests or if he gets suspended or not this year. So Chiefs wide receivers, how are you playing that? You can include Travis Kelce into this too as well if you're just aggressively saying, I'm going to go back to the Travis Kelce well. But Chiefs wide receivers, how are you playing this situation?
There is no situation that can make me look dumber than this year. But you have to plant some flags.
Yeah.
The term that I'm not in the Travis Kelce game this year. And I'm going to tell you why. Like last year, I know he got hurt early in the season and obviously didn't play week 1 and was battling that. And then they unleashed him in the playoffs. This is anecdotal, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Kelce could retire today and be a Hall of Famer. His personal legacy is solidified. The only thing the Chiefs have to do right now, and Andy Reid, by the way, could retire today and is a Hall of Famer. His legacy is solidified. The only thing the Chiefs really, their goal is right now is be the first team to win 3 consecutive Super Bowls. And so my whole thing with Kelce has been, I think he's going to be a smart time player. Not a part-time player, but a smart time player. I think the Chiefs are going to use him judiciously. And then hopefully he's healthy for the playoffs. And maybe this is his last year. Maybe this is the year he rides off into the sunset and has his big celebrity wedding, which I'm sure we know is coming. So I'm not in the Travis Kelce business this year. I am also not in the Xavier Worthy business this year. Again, fully willing to look stupid. But Marquise Brown has done it at the NFL level. And now with these kind of little drum beats that I think Rashee Rice's trial isn't until December now. That's when it was set. The Clark Hunt said they haven't heard anything from the NFL about a potential suspension. I feel like Rashee Rice at his current ADP could break leagues. And I have been very cautious on him right now. Like I have very little, if any, of him. Over the next 6 weeks, I think I'm going to draft as much Rashee Rice as I can. And I'll wear that. I just feel like, look, where would he be getting drafted if he was a choir boy this offseason? 2nd round? Would he be in the mix with the Ayuks and the Debos of the world? I kind of feel like that's where he'd be getting drafted. So I'm going to try to get that little bit of a discount on Rashee Rice right now, be that Jarvis Landry PPR god type of guy. And even though it's a guy that I've missed the boat on because I thought for sure he was going to get 8 to 10 games or whatever. What if he doesn't? And sometimes when you draft a high volume of teams, you have to argue against yourself. All right, I've been out on Rashee Rice because it looks like he's going to get suspended, but what if he doesn't? Then he's going to catch 100 passes this year. So that's kind of the way I have to approach this. So right now, if I'm entering a draft today, out on Kelce, fully willing to let that make me look stupid. Out on Worthy, in on Hollywood, in on Rashee Rice.
I like that. Yeah, I've been drafting Rice the most out of all these guys for the reason you laid out. Before his first arrest, or not even arrest, he had to go turn himself in because he was absent from the car, right? But he was going in the 4th round, so and now you can get him as a bench player. Especially amongst your wide receivers. And I assume that that's still going to probably be close to the case, even as we inch towards August, because they'll still be kind of one of those things that is pending. It's going to be weighed into his ADP a little bit, at least. So if you can get him as your wide receiver 4, your wide receiver 5, I feel that's great because you're already insulating yourself. And then if he doesn't get suspended, then you've just got a really premier flex compared to some of the guys he goes around. So I've been kind of biting at that apple right now because I expect his ADP to climb a little bit, especially over these next, these final 5 weeks of the offseason as well. I mean, Hollywood's just had a terrible run. I like that Hollywood bet on himself. I know that's more narrative-y, we're betting on that. But I mean, the last 2 years, he has the highest inaccurate target rate of any player that has as many targets as him. And he's got targets from 6 different quarterbacks, and they're all largely vagabonds outside of Kyler Murray, and they're not Patrick Mahomes. So as someone who has gone down the Torrey Smith's career arc path and come out empty-handed, I'm willing to do it again.
Yeah, I'm in on him. Like I'm in on Hollywood. Like I when I was drafting as if Rashee Rice was going to be suspended for a good portion of the season, I was way in on Hollywood ahead of Worthy. Like I thought Hollywood was a better straight up pick. Worthy was actually going ahead of him in ADP, and he might be again after one training camp highlight. So again, willing to, on some of these teams, you got to take stands that could make you look dumb, but we know the Chiefs are going to score points. Now the Chief I've drafted the most, believe it or not, is actually Pacheco. I think Pacheco has lower end sneaky bell cow upside. So if I start a draft with 3 receivers and I could get Pacheco in the 4th, which is possible on underdog at least, that is a strategy I love. But we know they're going to score points.
Yeah. I mean, in general, it's kind of an inverse strategy. I've always been an anchor running back guy, a hero running back, whatever you want to call it. And this year we have like a very finite amount of resources that fit the bill that I usually want to anchor around. And they all are high draft picks this year because everyone else sees it. You've got McCaffrey and you've got that little mini group of just Bijan and Breece Hall. And if I don't get one of those guys, I've been actually doing the inverse where I take 3 or 4 wide receivers to start, and then I'm into that Pacheco, Mixon, ETN range. And like it used to not be like that because those running backs would just always be 2nd and 3rd round picks. And this year they're not because of how aggressively, people are playing the wide receiver position. So I also have been doing some of those type of builds as well, where you just take the good running back and a good offense that can flirt with 300 touches, and you let that kind of fall as it will around your good wide receiver core that you've already built up. I love that. Let's do one other wide receiver group, and it's the Buffalo Bills. Obviously, you can factor in Dalton Kincaid into this as well as the pass catching options go. I mean, Kincaid's kind of a tricky guy because the Bills historically have always slow played their rookies, and everyone's brought up the splits of when Dawson Knox was gone and when Dawson Knox came back. Obviously, they got their wide receiver room entirely this offseason with the trade of Diggs. They let Gabe Davis walk. Khalil Shakur is the only wide receiver on the roster that's caught a pass from Josh Allen. How are you playing this room? Everyone's kind of cheap. And what I just said about Dalton Kincaid even being slow played as rookie, are you factoring that into as a potential for Keon Coleman?
Yeah, so I'm actually looking into my wallet right now. Shakir is my most drafted Buffalo receiver at 19% of my teams. As a matter of fact, he is my 6th most drafted receiver. So I don't have any strong feelings on these. I actually have Coleman on 13% of my teams, which quite frankly is more than I had anticipated. I don't have any strong feelings on any of these guys in particular. Like I have stronger feelings about Hollywood vis-a-vis Xavier Worthy. I just feel like Josh Allen's the QB1, right, by ADP. Well, somebody's going to catch the ball if that works out to be the case. So I've just been taking cheap shots and cheap shots, not like I'm kicking them in the nads, but like cheap shots as in like clicking on a cheap draft pick. I've just been taking more cheap shots on Shakir and Curtis Samuel because those guys are going in like the 9th, 10th round where there's really not a whole lot of appealing picks. So I might as well tie myself to an elite quarterback, or at least the quarterback that the market's telling me is elite because he's going as the quarterback 1. So I'm not in or out specifically on any of these guys, but like I see there's a lot like more upside in drafting like a Khalil Shakir or a Curtis Samuel than some of like the dead zone running backs who are going at that point. So I'm in on those guys, especially at cost. Shakir, I think, is my preferred one. As I just said, he's my most drafted receiver here. But Curtis Samuel goes right in that same range. And then obviously Keon Coleman goes a couple of rounds earlier. I think Kincaid's far and away the option to lead this team in receiving. But this could be I don't think we have at our projections, I don't think we have anybody getting more than a 20% target share here. We do think they're going to divvy it up. But if nobody gets more than 20%, that means the guys who are cheaper are probably going to be the guys who are going to going to emerge as the most productive players here. And that's why I've been drafting Shakir and Curtis Samuel more than Keon Coleman.
Yeah, I like that. I think the situation could ultimately play out a lot like the Packers situation did a year ago, where it's the sum of parts is better than the individual pieces, where it's kind of, head scratching week to week of trying to get it right or trying to get the touchdowns right. From a best ball stance, where I factor in floor a lot more than I do for redraft. In redraft, especially when we're talking the rounds where these guys are going, I want to take shots on like Shakir or even Coleman because I want to play the upside angle. I want to have as much upside as possible because I know from a floor stance, I can make roster moves, right? Like when I brick picks or guys get hurt, I have the option to make trades or drop players and pick up players. In best ball, that's a little different, right? Where like zeros actually matter in best ball. They can hurt you a lot more than they do in redraft because they're on your roster. Like they're taking roster spot. So I have been drafting more Curtis Samuel from a best ball stance now, but I can see him being the guy I draft the least when we get to August and we're drafting all these, teams that we have weekly management on versus the Shakirs and the Keon Colemans. I love that. Let's talk a little bit about a couple of the QB battles. Not really necessarily battles. There's one battle. Let's talk about the first battle. I guess it's maybe a slappers only type battle if you're a GoldenEye fan. And that's Gardner Minshew and Aidan O'Connell here. One, doesn't matter. Does it even matter who wins this to you, or do you have a preference and especially for the offense in general?
I just talked to Q Myers of the Locked On Raiders podcast for my Franchise Focus podcast series. And he was the first guy who I've actually heard come outright and say he thinks Aidan O'Connell's the heavy favorite to win the job. This was it heading into training camp. And he said the reason is because he's Davante Adams' boy. And he said they have a good relationship. Davante was the one who lobbied to bench Jimmy Garoppolo to get Aidan O'Connell on the field. So from that perspective, just the locker room narrative, I'd prefer that for Davante Adams, a player I'm not thrilled to draft this year, by the way. But I prefer for Davante Adams if Aidan O'Connell wins the job. Elsewhere, it doesn't matter to me. I view these guys as two sides of the same coin. It might be a double-headed coin like Two-Face has in Batman. It's just the same thing for me. You view them as like just kind of scrappy gunslingers. And look, at the very least, we know Aidan O'Connell can pepper Davante Adams with 20 targets. He did it in the championship game last year for fantasy. We also know that he could absolutely stink it up. Davante Adams in the semifinals had a one-catch game. So if you had Davante Adams in the semifinals, you might not have benefited from Davante Adams in the championship round. So this battle, it really only matters to me for Superflex leagues, because one of these guys is going to have value in a Superflex league. It's not going to affect the way I draft the team. At the very least, we know O'Connell can get the ball to Davante Adams on occasion. And Minshew, we've seen enough of to know he can get the Michael Pittman caught 100 passes last year. So we know Minshew can gunsling it around. This battle does not really, it doesn't really matter to me from a fantasy football standpoint. It doesn't affect the way I'm drafting the Raiders, which quite frankly isn't much of it at all.
Yeah, I've been in the same boat. Adams is interesting because he keeps plummeting as the summer moves on and more people keep jumping off the train. I've noticed he just like slowly gets lower and lower, and he keeps falling to areas where I'm like, man, this is 170 targets versus 120 targets. Like even the 50 of them are bad. Like,
was the market drafting him like as if they presume that drafting him it was a fait accompli that he was going to get traded? Is that like
it could have been that maybe we're factoring, because he early on he was going like right at the 1-2 turn kind of regularly, and if he slipped it was a little past there. Now he's getting very much closer to the back of the second round in a lot of drafts, as we've seen kind of more of a drumbeat of people bringing up his age and trying to catch a falling knife situation. But I've found myself, if I start with like CeeDee Lamb or Tyreek Hill or Amon, like any of those front end wide receivers that I know are going to get 150 plus targets, and then I'm just staring at those 150 other targets that are on the board. I'm like, wow, like, can I just leave 300 targets off my roster? Like
the illusion of balance has really hurt me in that regard with Davante Adams, because I've had so many teams where I've started at the top half with I want one of my top 8 receivers this year. Like on every team I draft, I want one of my top 8 receivers. And the market's sussed out who those guys are. Like I don't have a different guy in the top 8 than everybody else does. But one of the things that I've noticed, at least on Underdog, which is where I've done the heavy majority of my drafts right now, is the ability to start your draft with like Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jonathan Taylor, or Amon-Ra St. Brown and Saquon Barkley, has happened so much. And what I've found is mentally, I don't have a big distinction between the second round receivers and the third round receivers.
Mm-hmm.
Like I view like DK Metcalf and Devontae Adams and and Devontae Smith and Michael Pittman, some of those guys who are going in the third round, I view them as having similar upside to like Brandon Ayuk and Chris Olave, who are some of the second round receivers. So maybe I'm wrong on that, but that's why I've been kind of passing by Devontae Adams, because it's really hard for me to pass on Jonathan Taylor, the guy who was the consensus one in fantasy football 2 years ago, for a receiver who's getting older, might have a crappy quarterback, somebody who might hold out like Brandon Ayuk. That's been really my kind of first and second round approach right now, at least on Underdog. It has been.
So let's spin that into you're not factoring really any of these quarterbacks into the Devontae Adams conundrum where he's at, but what about Justin Jefferson and the Vikings quarterback situation? Typically we do see these first round quarterbacks play sooner than later, despite what word of mouth is right now. It does feel like the drumbeat for both Drake May and JJ McCarthy is a little different than in years past for some of these teams. But then you look at the schedules both these teams have, the Patriots and Vikings, and yeah, the Vikings do open up with the game, against the Giants. It is a road game at least, but then they just, before their week 6 bye, they play the 49ers, the Texans, the Packers, and the Jets. Like, they're not going to be favored. They're not favored in any of those games. Even if they start Sam Darnold, is it a situation we see JJ McCarthy in week 7? And the history of rookie quarterbacks and what they've done to lead wide receivers has historically been a decline. We're talking like Hall of Famers like Calvin Johnson, guys like Mike Evans played with rookie first round quarterbacks and had a drop in production. Not everyone's CJ Stroud. So how are you factoring in the quarterback situation in for Justin Jefferson versus some of those other top 8 guys? I assume Justin Jefferson is still in your top 8.
Yeah.
And just using him to split hairs. And then when do you expect McCarthy to start, if not week 1?
So I don't think he's going to start week 1. I believe their bye is week 6.
Mm-hmm.
And if we've gotten to the point where Sam Darnold is the Sam Darnold that we've always seen, who can titilize and tantalize and titillate was the word I was looking for, and tantalize, then he'll have a few moments. As a matter of fact, speaking of training camp reports, I saw that Justin Jefferson was like hooting and hollering at a throw that Darnold made impressively.
He was picked 2nd overall for a reason.
He has ability. And here's the way I view Jefferson. First and foremost, the market has already built in the projected decline of the quarterback, right? Because if Kirk Cousins was their quarterback, Justin Jefferson's the first wide receiver off the board.
Correct.
Maybe the first overall pick. You can get him 6, 7, 8 in drafts right now because of the quarterback conundrum. And I point to down the stretch last year. That game against Detroit on, I believe it was Christmas Eve, Nick Mullins is running around out there like an absolute freaking lunatic. Like, he's throwing hot air balloons out there. He throws for 4 interceptions in that game, and he still throws for 411 yards because he can throw the ball up to Justin Jefferson, and Justin Jefferson is going to come down, and Justin Jefferson is going to make plays. 6 for 141 and a touchdown in that game. And then in week 18, which probably helped for DFS, didn't help for fantasy, season long, 12 for 192 and a touchdown. This is with Nick Mullins. So I think Sam Darnold is probably a little better than Nick Mullins. I would hope J.J. McCarthy's better than Nick Mullins because they drafted him in the top 10 of the NFL draft. So I think the decline at quarterback play is already built into Justin Jefferson's ADP. I think he can produce with bad quarterback play. That's the kind of guy who transcends quarterbacks. I think there's very few of those guys, and he's one of them. So he is one of my top 8 receivers. I can't say like I'm out here saying I am drafting Justin Jefferson if I have the opportunity at every cost, because I do have to factor in that maybe Darnold and McCarthy are so god-awful that it doesn't matter. But the other thing I view with the Vikings is good offensive line. They just re-signed Christian Darrisaw, made him the highest paid left tackle in football. And that's a good foundation for both Darnold and McCarthy. At least they're going to be reasonably well protected, and they've got the best receiver in football. So I think Justin Jefferson is fairly priced. I think his decline in quarterback play is already factored into the markets.
Yeah, I mean, the Vikings offensive line has got to stay healthy. I mean, the past 2 years, they can't get all of Darisaw, Brian O'Neill, and Garrett Bradbury on the field together. Like,
Yeah.
that's been like the problem. Like, one of those guys is always out of the lineup at some part of time. The other thing with Jefferson is it's just so hard to knock him from like a target share perspective. Like, I think his floor is giving you something like what Devontae Adams gave you last year, and he's probably better because you factor in career arc and just the situation's better, right? You know, indoor team, Kevin O'Connell versus like, you know, Jimmy Garoppolo, Aidan O'Connell, you know, Antonio Pierce, all those different things. And you factor in the Hawkinson injury. We don't know what Addison's gonna like, what's gonna happen with Addison.
How much
like,
does Aaron Jones have left? Now that here's
Yeah.
the thing about Jones, though, is I think even if you think he's past his peak, which is hard to say after the playoffs last year, he's probably going to be better than what Madison gave them last year.
Oh, yeah.
So they will have a better run game.
Yeah, and the Vikings are a team too. 82% of their touchdowns last year are passing touchdowns. That's probably going to be more balanced this year than last. A little more rushing touchdowns. Well, we'll skip the Drake May conversation because I think like the Aidan O'Connell stuff like that doesn't really move a lot for you unless you have a real rebuttal to that, like you're hammering Jalen.
Doesn't.
Right now,
I mean, it's I'm drafting that team exactly the same, whoever the starting quarterback is.
But I do want to, before we jump into some auction talk, which, you know, I do love to mix in here. I do want to talk to you about your Eagles for a little bit.
Yeah.
A couple Eagles conversations. You got the Fanatics hat. You're no longer in Philadelphia though, right? Like,
I'm in South Carolina right now, man.
Yeah, that's what Matt said before the show. Yeah,
I'm in upstate South Carolina, which everybody's like, oh, you're near the beach. No, actually, I was way closer to the beach in Philadelphia than I am in South Carolina. But my wife's a professor at Clemson, so that's why we live here. So
Ooh, humble brag.
Yeah. Oh, believe me, I'm on the gravy train, man. Get that. Academics have such secure jobs, and yeah, it's great, man. I get to work from home. It's wonderful.
Let's talk about the Eagles for a minute, though. It's like, so obviously the Eagles are going to have a new dynamic this year. I'm not just talking about the coordinator change, but we can factor that in. I'll give you just like a top-down, all-encompassing Eagles pitch. One, last year, you know, they're a different team. The back half of the season, the front half of the season, Jalen Hurts has a knee injury. Obviously, they use Shane Steichen. Both coordinators get purged, but we won't talk about the defense. You know, how much are you factoring in this transition to Kellen Moore, who has kind of an up and down, you know, NFL track record, but this passing offense was so stale at the back half last year in terms of, you know, play action, pre-snap motion, those types of things. So one, how are you factoring in the transition to Kellen Moore and Jalen Hurts being on another coordinator, which is, I believe, his third and his fourth year as a starter.
4th and 5.
Yeah, and then I also want to talk about the addition of Saquon Barkley. You already have hinted that you're grabbing Saquon in the second round. How do you factor in Saquon Barkley, one, transitioning from a team, this is by far the best offense Saquon's been a part of in the NFL, but then also, you know, some give and take here, you know, do the receptions come down playing with a guy like Jalen Hurts? Do the touchdowns impact it? And then also tie that into the tush push and the retirement of Jason Kelce. Do you think that Jason Kelce's absence is going to impact that? Just give me the Eagles elevator pitch here on the top of drafts, because they're all getting drafted highly. I just don't know how you're playing them.
So here's the thing about the Eagles is, if you were to tell me they're going to melt down and go 7-10 and Nick Sirianni becomes the most reviled man in Philadelphia, perhaps unfairly, by the way, because he's taken them to 3 playoffs in 3 years. But if you were to tell me that happens, I wouldn't be surprised. If you were to tell me they go 13-4 and make the Super Bowl, I wouldn't be surprised. I think they're a highly volatile team. But here's why I'm in on them for fantasy. First and foremost, you are 100% right. Even though, like, look, the Eagles started, 10-1 last year? It really became it was like a pulling teeth 10-1.
Yeah.
And then at some point, you're like, all right, maybe they just got that special sauce. Like, I am a believer in, like, guys having dog. And I think Jalen Hurts has dog, but he started to doubt himself at the end of last year. And you're just like, the Eagles fans are like, all right, I can very clearly see that this offense is not the same offense, but they just keep doing it. So how am I, like, they went to the Super Bowl. They should have won the Super Bowl. Like, how do we deny what they're doing? And then everything went wrong for them. But here's why I'm drafting them highly. Because even though they collapsed at the end of last year, A.J. Brown produced, Devontae Smith produced, DeAndre Swift produced, Jalen Hurts produced. They all produced, even though the offense was a shell of itself. I think Kellen Moore is going to make them harder to defend. I don't understand. I literally don't know a legitimate argument for why the Eagles didn't use motion last year. I can't rack my brain around it. Like, I just don't understand why they didn't, but they didn't. I think they're going to do more of that. I think they're going to be more diverse. So I'm buying in. And I kind of look at the Eagles running back situation with Saquon. I view them kind of similarly to the 49ers. The 49ers had guys who produced in that offense. Raheem Mostert produced. You had Elijah Mitchell produce. And they tried to take shots in the second and third round on Davis Price and Trey Sermon. And they found guys who were undrafted who came in and produced. And they still determined we need a difference maker in the backfield. And they went and gave up 100 draft picks for Christian McCaffrey and then signed him to a massive extension this offseason. The Eagles just saw Miles Sanders run for 1,000, let him walk. They just saw DeAndre Swift run for 1,000. Let him walk. I think the Eagles front office, at the very least, has earned the benefit of the doubt. Not to say Howie Roseman doesn't make mistakes, but he's really good at cleaning up his mistakes. The Eagles very clearly view this guy as a difference maker. I don't think the Eagles are a front office who are in the business of signing a player just to spite a rival. I don't think they're in the business of that. I think they viewed Saquon Barkley as a difference maker. And I think Howie Roseman has earned the benefit of the doubt. So I understand the touchdown argument with Saquon. But the thing is, you have to factor in is Saquon has scored 10 or more touchdowns just twice in his NFL career. I know injuries have had something to do with that. But if they're on the 2-yard line, they're going to give it to Saquon. So it's just a matter of how often do they fall down at the 1-yard line, right? So I do think the tush push is still going to remain. I don't know if it's going to be as effective, but part of the reason it's effective is because Jalen Hurts squats 1,000,000 pounds. And by the way, Cam Jurgens, who's the new center, was really good at right guard last year. So we know he can block. The question is, can he make all the calls that Kelsey made? And that's the unknown question. I do think that the tush push is still going to be a factor, but I think the new offense with Kellen Moore, look at the fact that the Eagles don't have a number 3 receiver on this team. Is there a chance Saquon's third on this team in targets? I think there's a chance. And maybe they build in Kellen Moore, by the way. This is one thing Brett Whitefield told me, our data head at Fantasy Points. He said Kellen Moore is exceptional at building in checkdowns to his offense. And that's not something you think about when you got a play designer, but he's exceptional at that. And I think that's probably a factor for them signing Saquon. The Eagles ran 1,000,000 screens last year and they all sucked. I think they're going to be better at screens this year. I think they're going to use fewer of them, but they're going to be more effective. That's why I'm in on Saquon. I just think even in a bad offensive environment last year, and I say bad because the Eagles still scored a lot of points, all those guys produced. I think they're still going to produce this year, even if the team isn't great.
Yeah, one of the things I really hope to see from the Eagles in this transition, we haven't seen a lot of it from Kellen Moore, and maybe paired with Jalen Hurts, we won't see a lot of it, but I would love to see them play under center more than we have seen them play in Jalen Hurts' career. I did a study about where the league trends are going and just showed how dynamic of a difference this is, just being able to play multiple under center right now in the current state of the NFL with, all the too high stuff, all the zone coverage stuff, being able to run and pass from the same formation. And the Eagles kind of moved away from that. They just play so much shotgun and so much RPO game. I hope with the addition of Saquon paired with their offensive line that they are willing to kind of and just line up and play some bully ball on some teams and force some teams to come out of some of that stuff and be able to attack them. I think it would make Jalen Hurts a lot better and more efficient passer as well. So hopefully we do see that.
He was playing on hard mode, was Jalen Hurts. Obviously you mentioned it was, they never talked about his knee, but it was so obvious that he was protecting himself from contact. And also it was, hey, Jalen, you've got these elite receivers, these $100 million receivers. Just go make a play. No, what? Why don't you try to make it easy for those $100 million receivers to get open while also understanding that in the event that you have the wrong play call, they can still make bad offense. I think Kellen Moore is going to fix that this year.
I love that you brought up to one of my favorite dynamics of last year was the physical expressions or the deflating body language of DeAndre Swift when he got tackled at the 1-yard line. He knew it. He knew
I'm not scoring this touchdown.
He knew what happened. I several times he got tackled at the 1 and you just saw this look. He was like, damn it. Just damn it.
Yeah. He got paid. Hey, he got paid anyway. So good for DeAndre. So good.
Yeah. I love it here. Let's move in here. Back half of the show while I got here. You have an article coming out here. I don't know if it's officially out or it's about
not out yet. I'm
knocking on the door.
Yeah, I'm still building my sample teams, my auction draft plan, salary cap draft plan at Fantasy Points.
The Joe Dolan auction manifesto. I know it's not specifically called that, but it is kind of like the
I
top
would
10
call it
Bible.
that,
Yeah,
except
yeah,
SEO.
yeah.
Like those of us who come from a news writing background, which I did, and we just love to pat ourselves on the back when we came up with the best hammerhead for a news story, like New York Post style. Our skills have been absolutely eliminated from the field because creative titles don't matter. You need to make sure that your title tells you exactly what the article does and tells you exactly what it does twice over. So SEO picks it up. SEO has sapped my creativity, and I'm tired of
it. Let's talk about some of this though, because it's like an all-encompassing, walkthrough of how to handle auctions, and not just the players you're targeting, but like how to handle specific situations. And we'll talk about a couple of those top-down things as opposed to some of the like individual players of like saying to build on. One thing I want to give you a quick pitch on, gamers that haven't yet done an auction. What would your words of encouragement be to tell like their league to adopt, going to an auction format?
Because the draft is incredibly fun and incredibly stressful, and in an auction league, there is a chance for you to have a shot at the pie of every player. Now, of course, once you start bidding on players and winning bids, then that goes out the window. But if you draw like the number 8 pick in your draft, you're not getting Christian McCaffrey.
Dude, number 12 this year is a nightmare.
I hate 12 because there's a very good shot all 8 of my favorite receivers are off the board, and then I really have to pivot. Like, first and foremost, remove the chance that you draw the 12th pick this year. But you can go in and say, I'm gonna like, if you are a confident fantasy player, you are going to love auction salary cap leagues. Like, because you think you can outsmart people. If you think you can, this is the best way to prove it. Because you're essentially playing poker in addition to playing fantasy. Excuse me, I'm still, like I said, still getting over COVID. You're playing poker in addition to playing fantasy in terms of reading the room. Who's bluffing? Who does this guy need? What has his bidding strategy been like? And it's a really fascinating kind of dance that doesn't happen in other drafts.
Yeah, I love it too. It's for that reason, and giving everyone fair shot at every player, and then the way you can kind of use some things to your advantage here that we're going to talk about. Let's talk about the importance of sectioning off players in tiers. A lot of people have moved to tiers over individual rankings, but in an auction format, that's a little different. Let's talk about the importance of not getting caught on the back end of a tier, and then also how you can use the way you nominate players inside of a tier to your advantage.
So, like I just talked about, I want one of my top 8 receivers this year, maybe 2 of them, and in an auction I can get 2 of them, which is another fun way to draft. To make this simple, here are my top 8 receivers. Like I already mentioned it. It's Lamb, it's Hill, it's Chase, it's Jefferson, Brown, St. Brown, Nakua, Wilson, whichever order you want to put those guys in. The simplest way to talk about how I need to draft in an auction in terms of nomination or bidding, I do not want to be the last person in that tier to draft my player.
Right.
Because I have to assume in this day and age, everybody's got the same information or at least similar information to what I have. So everybody's going to know who the last player in a perceived tier is. And if you've been in an auction draft, Reeves, you know this very well. Garrett Wilson could go for more money than Tyreek Hill in an auction league because Tyreek Hill was nominated early and Garrett Wilson was nominated when no more of those top 8 receivers are on the board. That doesn't mean that Garrett Wilson can't outproduce Tyreek Hill this year, but if you're drafting at the end of every tier, chances are you're going to be paying a premium for an inferior product. So you get Garrett Wilson for 55 when Tyreek Hill went for 52. Might not sound like a lot, but those $3 at the end of your draft are going to be so important to winning those late round guys who are going to go underpriced. So it's important to come in with a plan. It's important to attack the beginning or the middle of a tier. If you definitely want one of those top 8 receivers, get them earlier rather than later, because I guarantee you the guy who goes last is going to go for more money than the guy who is perceived to be the better player. So that is a very important thing for me. And one of the things I'll do, let's just say I've drafted one of my top 8 receivers, I'm happy with that. I'll go into the tier 2 receivers next. If I'm nominating, baby. I'm nominating one of those top 8 receivers. I want money to come out of the rest of the league. So I'll taunt people with a nomination when I already have a player that I know I like at that tier. So I want one of my top 8 receivers, and then I'll let everybody else fight over the last 2 or 3 to go. So I want to see where the money's going. I'll start by saying, all right, let's see CeeDee Lamb gets nominated. Is this going to be an aggressive room that's going to bid up CeeDee Lamb to $70? Or is this going to be a sheepish room where CeeDee Lamb is like, oh, he's hovering around that $50 point and everybody's afraid to click the extra button? That'll completely affect the way I draft. Because if it's the sheepish version, I'll be in on Lamb and I'll get the first receiver off the board. If it's he's going for $70, I'll see what happens with Tyreek Hill, and then maybe I'll pivot to Amon-Ra St. Brown. So that's the way I'll draft with my tiers. It is very important to come in with a tiered plan for auctions.
Yeah, I love that. And, I always try to tell people, like, when you're in an auctions and you're looking at like a tier, and I'll do a visual for the podcast listeners and not the YouTubers, but it's like the letter U, right? Like when you start up,
very much so.
You're going to start here and it's going to dip down. It's going to dip down because people will say like, yeah, Christian McCaffrey, or like your 8 receiver is a good thing. Tyreek Hill, it dips down. People are like, well, this guy's left. I'll wait on this guy. The bidding got to a certain point. And then everyone's like, oh, there's only 2 of these guys left. There's only 1 of these guys left. And it just goes right back up, back up. And
that's a really good visual. Yeah, I like that a lot.
It always happens. Let me ask how you approach, your auctions kind of in relation to a snake draft. You already said like, I might have the opportunity to get 2 top 8 wide receivers where that doesn't happen in a snake draft because they're gone unless you get lucky and you get to like the turn and like something happened. Are you like more of a stars and scrubs guy? And then tie that into, also the inverse of not holding your money too long and always trying to catch values in an auction, because we see gamers make this mistake also.
Yeah. So the problem is there is still a finite supply of elite and very good players in fantasy football. So if you just wait to build your team with values, well, you might get values, but your team's going to suck. And what I'll guarantee you is you're sitting there at the end of your draft and you're like, oh man, I really like Tyrone Tracy. I want Tyrone Tracy this year. And you have $22 left. You're like, well, I might as well put $22 on Tyrone Tracy to make sure I win him. There is nothing worse than leaving your auction draft with budget that you can't spend that money. I haven't been in an auction yet where the money carries over, right? Oh, I only spent $173 on my team, so I have 27 extra fab dollars. No, I haven't been in a league that does that. So there's nothing worse than doing that. So you have to bid aggressively. If you wait for all values, your team is going to blow. That's going to happen. But anyway, in terms of specific builds, the ones that have worked for me the most in recent years, and this is just me, is either 0 RB or hero RB. Like spend up for 1 running back and then get a bunch of lower tier guys, or just go for a bunch of mid and lower tier guys and just go ham at wide receiver. I'm more likely to do that. If somebody's just getting into auctions this year and they ask me, what about stars and scrubs? My advice is just don't do it. Can it work? Yeah, it can. But think of, it's football, man. Like 78 different quarterbacks started a game last year. Like people get hurt. And if you're tying all your money into 4 awesome players and one of them gets hurt, you're done. And you can't predict who's going to get hurt. You can't. So my advice there is just don't do it. As a matter of fact, I've been in a league where somebody did that and fell asleep. And it was very obvious, like an hour into the draft. Like I was sitting next to Tom Brawley when we were doing this. I was like, I think Nate's asleep. Like it was just very obvious that he needed a running back and he just wasn't bidding on valuable players. I'm like, and he fell asleep doing stars and scrubs. That's the nightmare scenario. But it just don't do it. Like it's not fun. Oh yay, I spent all my money on Christian McCaffrey and Tyreek Hill and now I'm just waiting. Like it doesn't come back around to you. It's not a fun way to draft and it's not an optimal way to draft in my opinion.
Yeah, one of the things I think that matters more in auction drafts than even a redraft league, because redraft leagues, you're kind of looking at the teams around you and seeing what they're doing when you're making a draft pick, when you have to select an individual player. And you're like, oh, coming back to me, I know the team behind me already has a quarterback, so I can bypass quarterback this round maybe, and it comes back to me, I know he's not going to take a quarterback or she's not going to take a quarterback. But in an auction that's kind of wide open, you kind of need to pay attention to like all of the rosters, and it's kind of a big deal the way it factors into nominations, it factors into the tiers. So can you kind of just elaborate on that a little bit, of making sure that you're monitoring kind of like where all the rosters are around your league? Because that's another thing, like you said, it just makes the draft more of like a wide open thing that you need to be cognizant of.
So there's two things you have to monitor here, not just the roster spots. And by the way, there's another point. In auctions, you have two forms of finite currency.
Yeah.
Both your money and your roster spots. You can't drop a guy in the middle of the auction just because you misread the market and tried to start a bidding war for a player you didn't want. So that's one thing. Number two, you always have to be cognizant of who has the hammer. That's who I view as having the most money. You want to know what their budget is and what roster spots they need. And what I want to try to do is, if I'm not the hammer, and in the middle of the draft, I'll wax and wane between having that and then spending on the player I need, I do not want to be up against that guy in a tier. Like, you want to be ahead of the curve and say, okay, he already has 2 wide receivers, but he doesn't have a running back yet. And there's 3 running backs you feel really good about. Get on the running back train earlier and either encourage the guy who has the most money to spend it and then make sure one of those 2 guys is left for you, or get the first guy in that nomination and then wait for him to use his weight to push around the later. So there's multiple things you have to monitor. And this is why I like doing it, because my brain is constantly like, this guy's got the most money. This is his max bid. He definitely wants this running back. And just understanding, or even if let's just say I know, like Jonathan Taylor is the last of the top 6 running backs to come off the board. I know that guy has Jonathan Taylor. Well, I already have Jahmyr Gibbs, so I'm not going to go in for Jonathan Taylor. Throw him out there. Throw the chum to the sharks, man. Just let everybody bid it up. Get that. It's the most like exhilarating thing in an auction is when you start a bidding war by nominating a player that everybody wants that you don't need, because you're just like, let that money come out, man. Let it come out. And so there's multiple things you have to monitor. Like you mentioned in a snake draft, this guy doesn't need a quarterback, so I can wait. Those strategies are only really effective and useful if you're on one of the turns.
Mm-hmm.
Because like if you're in the middle of the round, it's too much to plan out 9 picks, right? But if you're at 10 or 3, you can look at the 4 picks between you and be like, okay, that's reasonable. In an auction, you're always constantly monitoring everybody else, and that makes it more fun to me.
Yeah, it's the best. One other thing that I think is interesting here was we talked about, not only does everyone have access to bid on any early round player in an auction, it also impacts like the sleepers and the flavor picks, right? Like everyone has flavor picks. You said like everyone's coming to your draft, they've read largely overlap the same amount of information you have, or a lot of the league has had, and everyone has their favorite players. Talk about the importance of not using that love or affection for those players to force you to overpay for said player. I've gotten to read your article, so I want to give a spoiler here, but like one of the guys that you used to highlight this is like Jaylen Warren's a really popular player this year.
Right.
Like everyone kind of wants Jaylen Warren. But also let's talk about Jaylen Warren comes out early. Are you using that to your advantage? Are you trying to nominate a guy like that early? Are you trying to wait? Because a lot of times people are in these auctions, they're holding their money for these types of players. They want to save their money because we know like CeeDee Lamb, Christian McCaffrey, these are going to go in a ballpark. But sometimes you're in these drafts and a guy like Jaylen Warren, you find out 6 people were waiting on him.
Yeah,
he ends up going and going and going. So like, let's talk about that for a little bit. How do you play the players that Joe Dolan, or like specifically, you want to have on your roster that necessarily aren't premium guys?
Yeah. So like the Jaylen Warren example is perfect, because if it gets to a point where it's obvious that that's the guy everybody's waiting for, he's going to go for more money than like David Montgomery, or he's going to go for more money than Joe Mixon, because everybody was like, this is the sleeper I have to have. And then you look back in hindsight and you're like, I cannot believe I paid $27 for Jaylen Warren when like DJ Moore went for 22. So you can kind of use that to your advantage in two ways. You can take the room by surprise early in the draft and like nominate him before Jonathan Taylor comes off the board. And you might be able to sneak him through for $7 because somebody's like, why is he nominated right now? Like, there's so many good players. On the other hand, if you wait too long and everybody's targeting that guy, he's going to get blown out of proportion. It really is a room-to-room kind of situation. And that guy, if you want to be able to have the money to get into bidding wars at the end of your draft for certain guys.
Yes.
But you don't want to go nuts. So I'm actually more likely to nominate one of those guys early and try to take people by surprise. And then if everybody gets in a bidding war for the popular sleeper, all right, I know damn well that there's going to be like a strong wide receiver 2 who's going to go for less money. And I'll take that guy and let everybody else fight over Jaylen Warren. But yeah, he's kind of the guy. And throughout the month of August, Reeves, you know this, there's going to be guys who emerge who are making training camp noise, who we call it our Mr. Relevant article at Fantasy Points. And we publish that at the end of August, which is just, these are guys going 150 plus picks into drafts who we really like this year. And all of those guys are going to be on everybody's end of draft boards, which also affects how you want to manage your money at the end of your draft, which is an entirely other conversation. But there's a lot that goes into it. And yeah, for Jaylen Warren in particular, like those sleepers, I'm more likely to throw them out early if I want them and just try to sneak them through. And if there's a bidding war, so be it. Let the wide receiver 2 that I know is going to go for way cheaper than he should fall to me.
Yeah, I actually like to play my guys, so to speak, earlier than expected for that reason, because I can just gauge whether I can get them through or not. Or, there was another gamer in the league that was aggressively also earmarking that player, and I can just move on and make my adjustments as far as that goes. And you talked about something being at the end. There's nothing worse than being dollared out with, multiple roster spots and then seeing those guys get nominated. And you're like, oh man, I can't even throw an extra bone at this. And you have to fill those roster spots. It's tough. Just real quick, because I know we're up against it here. Like, how aggressively do you push the dollar out? Like, is it, I know it's kind of nebulous. But is there like a roster, a number of roster spots you say, like, I don't want to need several players?
Yeah. So what do you mean by like at the end of the draft?
Yeah, where you can only bid $1, right? Like you're only able to get to your nomination.
I really don't want to have more than like 2 $1 guys on my roster, not counting kicker and defense. Here's just a general quality of life tip. Do not bid more than $1 for a kicker or defense. Don't do it. It's dumb. And that's why I actually like to nominate them early, because like, all right, I'll throw out Justin Tucker early. Because if I get him for $1, then yay, I have Justin Tucker. If somebody bids $2, hey, that idiot bid $2 for a kicker, and that dollar is going to come in handy later. I don't like to have more than like 2 or 3 $1 guys on my roster, because the problem is, and it ties back into everybody having the same sleepers. You have this mental like picture that like, oh, Tyrone Tracy's only a $1 guy. Yeah, but if everybody thinks he's a $1 guy and everybody only has 2 roster spots left, somebody who has $4 is going to bid $4 on Tyrone Tracy. So like, just because their value is as a $1 guy, everybody's not going to spend their money the same way in the auction. And some people are going to have more money later in the draft. So you have to monitor that as well. Oh, look, like the guy I just talked about earlier, Reeves, the guy who waits for all the values and his team actually ends up being pretty bad because he didn't pay up for premium talent. But that guy's going to have $15 for his last roster spot. So if you have the same sleeper in mind as that guy, he's going to outbid you because he can. So that doesn't mean he built his team optimally, but that's the other thing you got to monitor. Oh, this guy built his team like crap, and he clearly wants this sleeper at this position that I want. I've lost out on that. So you want to try to get ahead of that. So that's another strategy. Like, I don't like having more than 2 or 3 $1 guys, because the most stressful thing about an auction is when you throw out a $1 guy at the end of your draft and you're just watching that clock tick. And you're like, please, 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 please. Not only because you want the player, but because at some point you just want to fill out your roster so you can get out of there.
Right.
And so that is the most stressful part where you're like, this $1 guy, please let me have him. Please let me have him. And then you hear that click because somebody bid on him. And you're like, now I got to wait for the nominations to come all the way back around to me. Because you can't get when you only have $1 max bid, you can't get somebody that somebody else nominated.
Right.
You have to wait. You're essentially making snake picks. So that's the most stressful thing. That's why I like to have a little bit extra money and flexibility at the end of my draft.
Yeah, I love it. It's pretty funny. Our home league got rid of kickers, but there was a part of a period where we were just the first round of nominations. Everyone just did kicker for the same reason you said, and we were like, let's just do a snake draft for kickers if this is what we're going to be doing.
Yeah, no kidding.
We finally pushed kickers out of there. I love it though. I love it. If you're in a home league or a long-standing home league and you guys have been looking to spice it up or add something new or make some changes, I mean, easily auction is the best thing to do before you start trying to manipulate scoring rules or starting roster allocation, stuff like that. Like, just transition to auction, let it be more balanced. The event's going to be more fun and engaging for everybody if you do that. Yes, it's going to be more work, and you talk about it could be potentially last longer, but if you're doing one of these home leagues and this is how you see your friends or this is how you check in, like, you get to spend more time with them as well. It's a win-win situation. We're up against that hour here. That was great content as always. It's always great to catch up with you. As always, Joe he's the managing editor of Fantasy Points. He's the co-host of Fantasy Feast with Ross Tucker. He also does Fantasy Football Morning on SiriusXM. Joe, let everyone else know where they can find your work, what you have coming down the pipeline outside of this auction, manifesto.
Yeah, so I'm wrapping up my fantasy franchise focus YouTube series over at the Fantasy Points YouTube channel, which was an interview with an analyst for all 32 NFL teams. Can get some nuggets in there about some players who might be on the low end, what to expect from new offenses, and then throughout the month of August, just posting all of our articles at Fantasy Points in terms of targets, players, draft plans, all that stuff is going up. So I really hope everybody enjoyed the conversation. Reeves, thanks for having me.
Yeah, always. It's always great to catch up with you. I'm bummed I won't see you in 2 weeks, but happy birthday nonetheless.
Appreciate it.
As a reminder to everyone, that listening here, listen to Sharp Angles wherever you get your audio podcast. Subscribe, leave us a nice review. Also, ascribe to the Sharp Football Analysis YouTube channel. Head over to sharpfootballanalysis.com where you can order the 2024 Warren Sharp preview book and sign up for the draft kit that myself and Raymond Summerlin have poured hours into. I will be back in 2 weeks, I believe, with another guest, as I will be going to New York for that flex draft that you kind of talked about. So.
Yeah, I don't know if you could see it over my. No, I don't think I have them on display, but I had 3 and 4 years, Reeb. So
bang bang.
Yeah, I'm trying to go for my 4th this year. I got to order a trophy case. My wife got me a record player for my birthday, so I need to clear out like all those pictures and trophies over there. So I got to get a trophy case to display those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you throw it up for these podcasts, you want to have
no doubt
the stuff and the bling in the background. But yeah, for Joe, I'm Rich. Good luck, everybody. We'll be back in August.